AITAH for telling the new man of my ex-husband's mistress about the affair she had with my husband? It's strange to think how life can take turns that you never anticipate. I met my ex-husband when I was young, full of dreams, and barely thinking about how long the years ahead would actually feel. When we met, there was an easiness between us. A way he made me feel like the world's only girl. He was charming, always the center of any room. Someone people naturally gravitated towards. When we got married, I truly thought I'd found my partner for life. For a while, it seemed like I had. Together, we built a life. We had our routines, our favorite places, our little family unit that I thought would carry us through anything. My role was as a stay-at-home mom, and though it wasn't always easy, I put everything into being there for our kids and for him. He provided financially, and I took care of everything else. It seemed fair to me then, and I was happy to do it. But as the years went by, I began to see how that simplicity left me vulnerable. I relied on him financially and emotionally, putting my dreams on hold to make sure his could take root and grow. Then came Diana, the woman who seemed to slip into our lives like she'd always been there. Just out of sight, she was attractive, confident in a way that felt effortless, and a mutual acquaintance through a friend. I never would have thought she could become such a presence in our marriage. We'd see her at gatherings, and she and my ex-husband would talk and laugh as if they were old friends. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was harmless, but slowly, cracks began to appear. He started coming home late, spending longer hours at work, and becoming strangely defensive when I asked him about it. Eventually, I couldn't ignore the signs. When I confronted him, he looked at me, not with denial or shame, but with something like relief, as though he had been waiting to get caught. My world shattered in that instant, a crack splitting our life apart, leaving me stranded on one side and him on the other with a stranger I barely knew. Leaving was painful and terrifying. I had been financially dependent on him, and with no job, I was essentially starting from scratch. But I had to do it. Staying would have meant sacrificing myself entirely. So, I packed up, put my own insecurities aside, and focused on finding stability for myself and the kids. It was a slow, uphill climb, but I found my footing. And as difficult as it was, I eventually began to believe I'd made the right choice for my own dignity and peace. As for Diana, her cruelty wasn't limited to the affair. She'd actually bragged about it, rubbing my face in her win, like it was some kind of twisted game. When I found out, she made sure to twist the knife deeper, implying I wasn't enough for him, that she was some sort of upgrade. Looking back, it was an obvious attempt to make me feel small, to justify their betrayal, and as I walked away from that chapter, I tried my best to bury it, to leave her and him and all that pain in the past. Somewhere along the way, I heard whispers that she'd had a child, but my ex denied any involvement. We didn't discuss it, and I focused on rebuilding my life. I stayed out of his, keeping our interaction limited to co-parenting and nothing more. There was no way to erase the past, but I was determined not to let it haunt me either. Life has a funny way of circling back when you least expect it. Years passed after the divorce, and I worked hard to build a life for myself and my kids. I found strength I didn't know I had, clawing my way out of that dark chapter, determined to be my own support system. By the time I was back on my feet, the betrayal, though unforgettable, had lost its power over me. I was moving forward, feeling grateful for every day I didn't have to look back at the person who betrayed me. Then, out of nowhere, life brought Diana back into my world, this time in a way I could have never anticipated. One of my closest friends, Jackson, who lived in a nearby city, reached out excitedly one day. He was in love, engaged, and full of plans for a new chapter in his life. Over the years, Jackson and I had remained close. He was one of the constants in my life, always encouraging me and helping me focus on the positives. So naturally, I was thrilled for him. He had been waiting a long time to find someone he truly connected with. And hearing that he'd found the one made me genuinely happy. We didn't live in the same town, so our friendship had turned into occasional visits and lots of texts and calls. I didn't know much about his new fiancée beyond the few details he had mentioned. She was wonderful, virtuous, and had a good head on her shoulders. So when he invited me over to meet her, I didn't hesitate. I was eager to be a part of his happiness and to finally put a face to the name of the woman who had captured his heart. The day of our meeting arrived. It was a casual couples game night Jackson had set up, and I went over with excitement. I walked in, my heart light, looking forward to the evening. But the second I saw her, my blood ran cold. There she was, standing beside Jackson, her hand casually draped around his arm, a pleasant smile on her face, as if butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. I didn't need introductions to know who she was. Her face was one I could never forget, Diana, the woman who had played a starring role in dismantling my life. It felt like the ground had fallen out from under me. How could Jackson, my friend, end up engaged to Diana of all people? For a second, I thought I was dreaming, that there was no way this could actually be happening. I felt a wave of conflicting emotions, shock, anger, confusion, and, oddly enough, something that almost felt like betrayal. Jackson had no idea who she was, of course. But the idea of him unwittingly pulling her into my circle was surreal. She looked shocked, too, but not in the way I'd hoped. She wasn't surprised because of some remorse over our shared past. She was shocked because she'd been found out. I watched her freeze, her face stiffening, eyes widening as she realized who I was. Her reaction was one of someone whose cover had just been blown. And suddenly, I knew she had been keeping this secret from Jackson. Once the initial shock wore off, I was left feeling numb. Diana's presence filled me with a sickening tension. But I held it together. At least outwardly, Jackson was all smiles, introducing her to everyone, totally oblivious to the silent drama playing out between Diana and me. She avoided eye contact with me, plastering on a smile that looked about as genuine as a plastic rose. I kept a neutral expression, trying to mask the flood of emotions bubbling beneath the surface. Jackson seemed so happy, so full of pride as he introduced Diana, and it broke my heart. How could I tell him who she really was? How could I shatter the image he had of this wonderful woman? At first, I wanted to leave, to spare him the discomfort and avoid the bombshell that felt destined to go off. But that wasn't right. Jackson was my friend, someone who had supported me unconditionally through my worst days. He deserved to know the truth, even if it meant disrupting his happiness. The night carried on, with me quietly observing, while Diana cast anxious glances in my direction. She looked cornered, and for good reason. At one point, Jackson noticed something was off. He pulled me aside, asking if I was okay and if there was something bothering me. I couldn't dodge the question forever, so I decided to be honest with him. At least partially. I told him that I knew Diana from years ago, and I wanted to discuss it with him alone after the party. I knew that was enough to plant the seed, to make him wonder but not yet worry. Diana noticed our private conversation, and I saw the panic in her eyes. She attempted to pull Jackson away at every chance, keeping him distracted and laughing, as if sheer charm could gloss over the tension between us. But the more she tried, the more she aroused his curiosity. Finally, he excused himself, giving me a quiet nod, signaling he would talk to me later. Diana caught on, and by the end of the evening, she looked more anxious than ever. The next day, Jackson invited me over for coffee. We were sitting on his back porch, and he opened up by saying, "I can tell something is weighing on you. And if it's about Diana, I need to know. Don't hold back." I took a deep breath, unsure of how to start. But I began with the truth. I explained how I knew Diana, about her affair with my ex-husband, and how her involvement had torn my marriage apart. I told him the real story, how she'd shamelessly rubbed it in my face, taking delight in the misery she had caused. I didn't spare any details, nor did I try to make it sound kinder than it was. Jackson deserved to know who he was about to marry. He sat there, absorbing every word, his expression shifting from shock to disbelief and then finally settling into a look of betrayal. Diana had lied to him. She'd told him she'd never been involved in an affair, that she was a victim of past relationships, even fabricating a story about the father of her child. When I finished, he sat silently, staring into his coffee, lost in thought. He finally said, "Thank you for telling me. I had no idea. It wasn't easy, but I felt a strange relief knowing he'd heard the truth. I didn't care if Diana felt exposed or if she blamed me for blowing up her life. She'd built her relationship with Jackson on a foundation of lies, hoping her past wouldn't catch up to her. Now, he had to decide what to do with that truth. And while I couldn't predict his next move, I knew that my conscience was clear. Once the truth was out, the immediate aftermath felt almost anticlimactic. Jackson didn't say much after I left his place that day. He just thanked me quietly, his mind clearly spinning, and I could see the sadness clouding his face. I knew that Diana would probably show up soon to twist the story or beg him for forgiveness. And I left feeling like I dropped a pebble into a pond, knowing the ripples would grow but not knowing how far they'd reach. I didn't hear from Jackson for a few days. I assumed he was dealing with the fallout, maybe confronting Diana or trying to process what I'd told him. I wanted to check in on him, but I didn't want to intrude. This was his decision now. He needed time and space to figure out how he wanted to move forward. And I wasn't about to push. Then came the text. A short, simple message from Jackson. "Can we talk?" I replied immediately, telling him to come over whenever he was ready. I could sense the weight behind his words, the finality in them, and braced myself for what he might say. When he arrived, he looked exhausted. It was as if he'd aged in those few days since we last spoke. We settled in my living room, and he began slowly, hesitantly, telling me what had happened since our conversation. The day after I'd told him the truth, he'd confronted Diana. Apparently, she tried to dismiss everything at first, saying I was bitter, that I was twisting the story out of jealousy or some other flimsy excuse. But Jackson knew me better than that, and he pressed her. When she realized he wasn't backing down, she finally admitted to the affair with my ex-husband, though she painted herself as the victim, claiming she'd been young and confused back then. She denied ever being cruel to me, attempting to rewrite history to minimize her actions. She begged Jackson not to throw away what they had over a mistake from the past, promising it was nothing more than a poor decision she'd made a long time ago. But the lies didn't stop there. He found out she'd lied about how her son had been conceived, telling him a fabricated story to paint herself in a more sympathetic light. She'd even hidden details of her financial instability, letting him foot the bill and pay her expenses while she planned her future on his dime. Jackson was devastated. His image of her, the woman he thought he loved, was gone. He was seeing her for who she really was, someone willing to manipulate and deceive to get what she wanted. Sitting across from me, Jackson's face held a mix of heartbreak and anger. He told me he'd ended things, cancelled the engagement, and made it clear to her that she had to take responsibility for her past actions. He said it wasn't about the affair itself as much as it was about the lies, the manipulation, the half-truths she'd woven into their relationship. He couldn't marry someone he no longer trusted. While I felt relief for Jackson, I couldn't ignore the sadness in his eyes. He'd invested so much in her, planning a life together, and now he was left with nothing but betrayal and disappointment. In that moment, I wished none of this had ever happened, that Diana had stayed a distant memory rather than resurfacing to break my friend's heart. But I knew I'd done the right thing. If I hadn't told him, he'd have built a life on deception. He needed the truth, no matter how painful it was. A part of me felt the sting of old wounds reopening, watching the fallout of Diana's actions once again disrupt lives. Yet, there was also a glimmer of peace, knowing that this time, the truth had come to light. I could finally let go of the lingering resentment I'd held for years. It was over. Once the dust settled, I expected to feel some sense of closure. Instead, I felt the lingering traces of tension, an unsettling mixture of relief and regret. Jackson and I had many conversations over the next few weeks, as he grappled with feelings of betrayal, and I tried to help him process everything without letting my own past color his perception too much. Each time we talked, I tried to focus on the future, encouraging him to look forward rather than back. Yet, I couldn't shake the echo of my own hurt. This wasn't just his story, it was the conclusion of mine. 2. Our friends, on the other hand, had very different reactions. They didn't mince words when it came to sharing their opinions. A few told me point blank that I shouldn't have interfered. That I should have left Jackson to his blissful ignorance. Some thought I'd gone out of my way to stir up drama, projecting my own hurt onto him instead of moving forward. I'd expected a few mixed reactions, but the criticism cut deeper than I anticipated. I'd known my actions would have consequences, but the backlash brought me right back to questioning myself. Had I been wrong to tell him? Was it selfish to expose Diana's truth because of what I'd endured? Yet, there were others, friends who knew me better, who'd seen me struggle after the end of my marriage, who said they'd have done the same. They reminded me that honesty is sometimes a bitter pill, especially when it unearths the kind of secrets people bury. They believed I'd saved Jackson from a life built on deception. As one friend put it, she wasn't going to change, and he deserved to know who he was really marrying. It was a reminder that truth, no matter how hurtful, was better than the alternative. I'd been trying to reframe it in my own mind, too, reminding myself that I didn't act out of malice but out of a desire to protect Jackson from a painful reality he might only discover too late. When I replayed the events in my head, I could see the pieces of my past falling into place, not as random fragments but as experiences that led to this moment. I knew firsthand the hollow ache of betrayal, the bitter taste of betrayal when someone you trust shatters your world. In exposing Diana, I hoped Jackson would never have to feel that. Diana's parting words, however, haunted me. She'd accused me of being vindictive, of using Jackson's situation to serve my own vendetta against her. I had to admit, a small part of me had taken some satisfaction in revealing her lies. It felt like a long-delayed reckoning for the hurt she'd inflicted on me. Yet I knew that my intention wasn't rooted in revenge, it was rooted in honesty. She'd crafted a narrative for Jackson that wasn't just deceitful, it was harmful. That, I felt, was a truth he deserved to know. Eventually, Jackson moved on, though I could tell he carried the weight of what happened. He threw himself into work and other friendships, rebuilding his sense of self after the shattering realization that his engagement had been built on lies. As for me, I felt like I'd emerged from a shadow that had loomed over me for years. A weight I hadn't even fully realized I was carrying. I'd always believed that people like Diana never really paid for their actions. But now, I saw her for who she was. Someone who would always struggle with the consequences of her own choices, even if I was no longer a part of them. Over time, I realized that my life felt lighter. I no longer thought of Diana with bitterness. She'd faded into the background of my past. A lesson rather than a grudge. With that weight lifted, I could focus on the parts of my life that truly mattered, my friends, my career, my own sense of self-worth, unburdened by the choices of others. In helping Jackson, I'd reclaimed a piece of my own story, one where I wasn't just a victim of betrayal, but someone who could move forward with strength and integrity. At the end of it all, I realized that my story wasn't just about telling the truth, it was about finally letting go. Despite my best efforts to focus on the positive and frame my choice as an act of honesty, the fallout from revealing Diana's past didn't settle as easily as I'd hoped. Jackson and I continued to talk, but there was a clear shift in our dynamic. His reactions ranged from gratitude for my honesty to guarded resentment, something I couldn't entirely blame him for. He'd had to face a harsh reality because of my actions, and though he understood my reasoning, I think he wrestled with whether he could trust anyone anymore, including me. Our conversations grew shorter, less personal, and gradually dwindled until we stopped talking altogether. The shift in our friendship hit me harder than I expected. I had hoped that by telling the truth, I'd be protecting someone close to me, but I hadn't anticipated the layers of distrust that would arise afterward. In Jackson's eyes, I had not only exposed Diana's lies but also forced him to confront aspects of his own life that he may not have been ready to see. I questioned my decision constantly, wondering if I'd sacrificed my friendship with Jackson for some twisted version of closure. Beyond Jackson, other mutual friends weighed in. Some praised me for my honesty, saying they'd have done the same if they'd known. But others distanced themselves, claiming that I was stirring the pot, unnecessarily, or projecting my own past pain onto an otherwise happy relationship. Those criticisms felt like a harsh judgment, forcing me to reconsider not just my actions but the narrative I'd created around them. Was I truly acting out of kindness? Or had I wanted to see Diana fall from grace because I had once been in her crosshairs? This inner conflict stayed with me for months. I'd think about it while driving home, sitting in bed, or even during work meetings. I replayed each moment in my mind, wondering how things would have turned out if I had just kept quiet. Letting Jackson marry Diana without interference. It gnawed at me, this lingering sense of guilt mixed with righteousness, as if I couldn't quite reconcile the two. What made it worse was that Diana seemed to thrive despite everything. She posted pictures on social media, appearing carefree, surrounded by her friends and family, living her life without any visible remorse or regret. It was as though the truth I'd revealed hadn't touched her at all. Meanwhile, Jackson's posts had all but disappeared. He'd retreated into his own world, leaving me to wonder if he'd ever fully moved on. The outcome felt hollow and unresolved, with no real sense of closure or justice. In time, I started seeing a therapist, needing a space to process the complicated emotions that had taken root since I told Jackson about Diana. I realized that my need for justice, maybe even vengeance, had skewed my sense of reality. I'd held onto my anger, letting it fester and manifest in ways I hadn't acknowledged. Through therapy, I began to explore these feelings, learning to let go of the need to control how others perceived me or my actions. My therapist helped me see that, while my intentions were rooted in honesty, the path I'd chosen had still carried unintended consequences. I'd aimed to be the bearer of truth but found myself swept into a deeper conflict that hurt more people than it helped. She encouraged me to redefine my sense of self, no longer rooted in the need for validation or approval from those who didn't understand my journey. Gradually, I started to release the hold that this experience had on me. I began to rebuild my life with a focus on growth and self-awareness, setting boundaries that allowed me to move forward without the weight of others' expectations. The lingering resentment faded, and over time, I found myself less concerned with Diana's choices, her life, or even Jackson's opinion of me. I realized that their paths were theirs to navigate, just as mine was my own. In the end, I learned that standing up for the truth, while noble, sometimes comes with a cost. But I also learned to let go of that cost, choosing instead to live authentically and leave the past behind. I hadn't erased the scars from my experience, but I'd found a way to live with them, using them as reminders of resilience rather than regrets. As the months passed, I found myself growing from the messiness of everything I'd been through. My friendship with Jackson had faded to a distant memory, and Diana's presence in my mind had lessened to the point where I rarely thought of her at all. Instead, I focused on reclaiming a sense of peace in my life, not just from this incident, but from the lingering pain that I'd been holding onto since my divorce. This situation had unearthed wounds I hadn't fully faced, and I finally realized it was time to let them heal completely. Oddly enough, it was the quiet moments that helped me move forward. Sunday mornings with coffee and a book, long drives with the windows down, hours spent laughing with close friends. All these small moments stitched together into a life that felt whole again. I no longer felt the weight of needing validation from Jackson or anyone else. I began to enjoy things simply for the sake of enjoying them, not because I was running from a memory or trying to prove anything to anyone. I let the heaviness slip away, embracing a sense of lightness I hadn't known I needed. During this time, I also reconnected with friends I'd drifted from, friends who had seen me at my worst during the divorce, who understood me at my core and valued me as a person beyond any drama or choices I made. Spending time with them reminded me that people could genuinely care without judgment. And it was refreshing to have relationships without the added complications. Meanwhile, my sessions with my therapist helped me make sense of the tangled emotions I'd carried for so long. I began to forgive myself, not just for what had happened with Jackson, but for the resentment and anger I'd allowed to linger from my marriage's end. Forgiving myself wasn't easy. I had to accept that my actions had unintended consequences. But it also meant recognizing that I'd acted from a place of hurt, something I hadn't fully acknowledged before. I'd learned the hard way that honesty is complex. Sometimes it comes at a price we don't anticipate. In a strange way, I even found myself feeling a hint of gratitude toward Diana. While I didn't condone her past or her choices, She'd inadvertently pushed me to confront aspects of myself that I might have ignored for years. Her presence had stirred up an old anger that I needed to release. And while it had been challenging, the experience ultimately guided me toward a place of growth and acceptance. As I moved forward, I decided to make new choices that aligned with the person I'd become. I'd learned that healing isn't about erasing the past but understanding it, letting it shape you, and moving on with grace. I'd also learned that my worth wasn't tied to the validation of others or the roles they expected me to play in their lives. Instead, it was about my sense of self and the life I wanted to create for myself, free from resentment or regret. By the time I fully emerged from this chapter, I felt stronger, more resilient, and more at peace. I'd let go of my need to control others' perceptions, choosing instead to control my own reactions and shape my own narrative. No longer burdened by the weight of the past, I was free to build a future that was uniquely mine, a future built on self-respect, healing, and growth. Moving past everything with Jackson, Diana, and my ex-husband was harder than I had imagined. Even though I'd come a long way, some days felt like I was on autopilot, going through the motions without a clear sense of what came next. This emotional weight left me feeling empty in ways I hadn't anticipated. And it forced me to reckon with my own choices and boundaries, what I would and wouldn't allow in my life from here on out. What surprised me most was how much I'd lost trust in myself. Every decision seemed to carry an undertone of self-doubt. Questions crept in, like whether I was too quick to react, too harsh in my judgments, or too loyal to my own emotions. But through therapy and introspection, I began to rebuild that trust, slowly proving to myself that I could rely on my own judgment and recognize when my past pain was clouding it. My journey toward closure wasn't linear. On some days, I felt resilient and confident, like I could finally make peace with what had happened. But on others, I found myself mulling over each twist and turn, dissecting my responses and replaying moments of conflict. I had to remind myself often that closure didn't mean I'd never feel the hurt again. It simply meant I'd be able to coexist with it and not let it dictate my happiness. My conversations with friends helped me gain perspective. They reminded me that even though I'd gone through a painful and complicated experience, it was just that, an experience. It didn't define me, and it didn't have to limit my view of others or myself. Their support was a powerful reminder of the value of genuine connections and the people who'd always stood by me, without judgment or expectations. As I continued to navigate life, I found new ways to reconnect with myself. I began journaling, documenting my thoughts and feelings, unraveling the lingering emotions I couldn't always articulate. In these pages, I started to understand my fears and recognize patterns in my reactions. This self-reflection gave me a sense of ownership over my life again. I could see my progress and acknowledge both the good and the bad without shame. Through these reflections, I discovered that my response to everything with Diana and Jackson had been deeply rooted in an old wound, the pain of betrayal that I'd never truly healed from my ex-husband's infidelity. Over time, the bitterness softened. I began to see the experience with Jackson not as a punishment but as a hard-earned lesson. I no longer felt the need to cling to people or ideas that didn't align with who I was becoming. I realized that I had let anger guide too many of my choices. And I didn't want to carry that burden anymore. Instead, I wanted to create space for empathy, for others but, most importantly, for myself. I started focusing on healthier boundaries, learning to articulate my needs without fear of conflict. I promised myself that I would never again betray my own values for someone else's comfort. I knew I'd made mistakes, but I also knew I had the capacity to learn from them. My past no longer felt like a weight but a part of my story, a story that shaped me without defining me. Forgiving myself was the last step in my healing journey. It took time, patience, and a lot of kindness toward myself. I realized that forgiving myself didn't mean excusing my actions but accepting them, learning from them, and moving forward. I finally understood that I was allowed to make mistakes and to grow from them without carrying the burden of guilt forever. With this newfound clarity, I felt ready to fully let go of the past. I was able to accept that some relationships, like the one with Jackson, weren't meant to last. And that was okay. Not every connection is meant to be permanent. But each one brings a lesson, a gift, or a new perspective. In the end, I found peace not in forgetting what had happened but in understanding it, embracing the wisdom it brought, and trusting myself again. I knew I could move forward, equipped with the resilience and self-awareness I'd gained from this journey. AITA for leaving my mom's birthday dinner early because she invited my ex without telling me. When Hannah and I broke up, it felt like losing a part of myself. We'd been together for 4 years, long enough that everything from favorite TV shows to go-to restaurants had her woven into them. Our lives had slowly entwined to the point where even the small things, the morning coffee routine, the quirky shared playlists, were filled with her presence. Ending that wasn't explosive, but it cut deep, leaving this hollow ache I hadn't anticipated. Everyone says breakups hurt, but it's like no amount of advice can prepare you for the quiet, creeping sense of loss that settles in once the dust clears. I'd moved out of the apartment we'd shared and into a smaller, quieter space across town. I wanted a fresh start, a place that wouldn't have her fingerprints on every inch of it. Family was my lifeline through those first few weeks. Especially Mom. She was the kind of person who would bring over food and fuss around the house, trying to take my mind off things by suggesting reorganizing shelves or sorting through old photos. Mom adored Hannah, though, and I knew she was heartbroken too. My whole family had fallen for her kind, easygoing nature, and I could see how much the split disappointed them. My mom and sister even tried, a few times, to broach the subject with me, expressing their sadness over her absence. I asked them not to mention her, though, making it clear that I needed space from anything connected to that chapter. I think they understood, at least initially. They seemed to get that I couldn't move forward if I kept looking back. So, when Mom invited me to her 60th birthday dinner, I was looking forward to it. After the breakup, I'd withdrawn quite a bit, so going out for something celebratory and spending time with my family felt like a necessary step. Mom's birthday was a big milestone, and I wanted to be there, to show her I was okay. She had planned a nice dinner with the family, along with a few of her close friends. A small affair but special to her. As her birthday neared, I'd felt the edge of that hollow ache start to dull. Each day got a little easier, fewer things reminded me of her. I'd even started seeing other friends. Getting out there, as people say, though I wasn't looking to meet anyone. I was just trying to rediscover a version of me that wasn't tied to someone else. It's not easy, pulling yourself out of something you'd put so much into. But this dinner was going to be one more piece in rebuilding that foundation. When I arrived at the restaurant for Mom's birthday dinner, I felt hopeful. It wasn't often I felt that these days, so the feeling was almost foreign. The place was one of Mom's favorites, a cozy Italian spot she'd chosen for nearly every family celebration. Seeing the soft lights and smelling the familiar garlic-scented air as I walked in, I reminded myself that tonight was about Mom. I could set everything else aside, just enjoy her day and focus on something positive. As soon as I walked in, I noticed her. Hannah was there, standing off to the side, chatting with my aunt like she belonged. The color drained from my face, and my heart felt like it had skipped a beat. It was like I'd been hit by a wave. Seeing her there, laughing, casual, as if nothing had changed. For a moment, I thought I might turn around and leave. But that would have caused an even bigger scene. So I stayed, feeling rooted to the spot. I went over to greet Mom, doing my best to smile, and leaned in close enough so I could quietly ask her why Hannah was here. She brushed off my question almost immediately, waving a hand and saying she thought it would be nice for Hannah to be there. As she'd always been close to the family, I could feel my stomach drop. Mom said it so nonchalantly, as if Hannah showing up after our breakup, unannounced, was the most normal thing in the world. I held my breath, trying to keep my cool. This was supposed to be a celebration, and I was standing there trying to rein in the wave of emotions that seeing her had unleashed. Mom added that she thought Hannah's presence might even help me, seeing as I'd seemed so down lately. She mentioned, gently, that I hadn't been myself since the breakup, as if bringing Hannah here would somehow make me feel whole again. It was like she'd been under the impression that putting us in the same room would somehow close the chapter with a neat, sentimental bow. It felt surreal, like I was outside of myself watching the whole thing happen. Here I was, surrounded by family, yet feeling more out of place than I'd ever felt. The whole idea of moving on I'd been working so hard for seemed to crumble in seconds. I couldn't decide if I was hurt, angry, or just plain disappointed. All I knew was that I was barely holding it together. And the night had barely even started. Dinner felt like an emotional minefield. I made small talk with my cousins, laughed at a few jokes my uncle cracked, and did my best to settle into the evening. But the entire time, I was painfully aware of Hannah's presence. She sat diagonally across from me, close enough to catch every laugh and smile she shared with my family. Her ease in these surroundings, her effortless familiarity with everyone, felt like a knife twist, reminding me of just how long we'd been together. She wasn't just someone I dated, she'd been woven into the fabric of my family. And that fabric was fraying with every stolen glance and uneasy moment. Mom's attempt at playing matchmaker, if that's what this was, left me feeling betrayed. I'd been clear about wanting space, and it wasn't as though I'd asked her for much in that regard. But the way she looked at us, eyes hopeful as she'd glance from Hannah to me, made it obvious she wasn't letting go as easily as I had. For Mom, Hannah wasn't just an ex-girlfriend of her son, she was someone who'd shared holidays, family secrets, and countless dinners. Seeing her here wasn't just a casual get-together. It was Mom clinging to the possibility of things going back to the way they were. And, maybe, a sense of the family staying whole. Just when I thought I could coast through the dinner with minimal conversation, Mom decided it was time for nostalgia. She launched into stories from a few years back. Tales that featured both Hannah and me. Each little anecdote had a sting. There was the story about the time Hannah and I had baked a disastrous birthday cake for Mom that ended up tasting like pure salt instead of sugar. Everyone laughed, Hannah included, and I forced a smile. But I could feel myself tensing up with each word. The memories that were once our private stories were suddenly being paraded out in front of everyone, reminding me of just how much history I shared with her, and how impossible it was to simply move on. The final blow came when my aunt, bless her oblivious heart, made a toast. Raising her glass, she said something about how wonderful it was to have everyone gathered in. Hopefully, seeing Hannah around more often. My chest tightened as I looked down at my plate, the food tasting like cardboard. I could feel everyone looking at me, trying to gauge my reaction. I felt like I was under a spotlight, every smile and glance scrutinized, as if my family was silently willing me to make amends, to laugh and pretend everything was okay. But it wasn't okay. The unspoken expectations, the thinly veiled hopes my family had woven around Hannah and me, they felt like a weight around my neck. I kept trying to swallow my irritation, to play the part of the dutiful son who wouldn't dare make a scene on his mother's milestone birthday. But I could feel it bubbling under the surface, a wave of frustration that was becoming harder to control. The very thought of holding it together for the rest of the evening seemed impossible. I felt like an outsider at my own family gathering, watching them embrace a version of my life that no longer existed. I made my way outside under the pretense of needing some fresh air. The cool night air was a relief, and I took a deep breath, trying to gather myself. In that moment, I felt the urge to call a friend, someone who could understand what it felt like to have an ex woven so thoroughly into the tapestry of your life that even your own family couldn't untangle it. But, in truth, I didn't have the energy to rehash everything over the phone. I just needed a few moments of peace to process, to remind myself why I was here and why I hadn't already left. Moments later, I heard the sound of the door opening and closing, and my heart sank. I hoped for anyone but Hannah. But there she was, stepping out onto the porch. She approached slowly, giving me a sympathetic look. Part of me wanted to tell her to go back inside, to leave me alone to sort through my emotions. But another part of me knew she hadn't done anything wrong by simply showing up. She'd been invited. After all, she was here at my mother's request. Not to stir up old feelings or create tension. She started talking, and I listened politely, though my mind was elsewhere. She spoke about how much she missed the family, how they'd made her feel like she belonged somewhere. I could understand that. My family had a way of wrapping people into their embrace, of making them feel like they had a place. But it didn't change the fact that she and I were no longer that my family seemed to still want. Every word reminded me of what we'd once had and what was lost, making it harder to ignore the ache that had been lurking beneath my calm exterior. When she finally paused, I told her I was happy she felt that way, but I had to draw my boundaries. I explained, maybe a bit too bluntly, that I was here to celebrate my mom, not to reminisce about what was over. She seemed taken aback, her face falling just a bit, but she nodded in understanding. She wished me well and returned inside. Alone again, I felt the frustration build, not so much at Hannah as at the situation itself. I was angry at the fact that my family had tried to bring us together without even considering what I might need or want. It felt like they'd prioritized their attachment to Hannah over my boundaries. Like they had ignored the pain I'd gone through just to arrive at this place of acceptance. I knew I couldn't stay. Going back inside felt like agreeing to a narrative that didn't belong to me anymore. I could hear faint sounds of laughter through the door, and it hit me that I would always be just a character in the story my family had written for me, a story that didn't account for the complexities of moving on or the boundaries I needed. I stepped away from the porch and made my way to my car, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and relief. By the time I reached home, the weight of guilt had started to creep in, settling in a hollow ache in my chest. I knew my mom would be hurt that I'd left, especially on her big day. I had managed to put some distance between myself and the dinner, but it hadn't exactly freed me from the mess of emotions I carried with me. I knew I'd crossed a line by leaving, yet I couldn't help but feel my own boundaries had been crossed. 2. I sank into the couch, scrolling through my messages, half expecting an angry text or a phone call. Nothing came, but the silence was just as heavy. In our family, conflict didn't usually brew over for long, and typically, things would return to normal after a few days. But this felt different. It was more than just a missed dinner. It was about how my needs, my choices, were seen, or not seen, by the people closest to me. When my mom finally did call, her disappointment was evident in her tone. She told me how upset she was that I had ruined her night. She couldn't understand why I hadn't just stayed, why I'd chosen that moment, of all nights, to stand firm on a boundary that to her seemed so small. To her, it had been a simple, well-meaning decision. She saw Hannah as family, as someone who had been through so much with us and had left a positive mark on all of them. I listened, trying to keep my voice steady. I knew I couldn't dismiss her hurt, but I also felt she wasn't hearing mine. I tried explaining my side gently, that seeing Hannah, especially without warning, felt like rubbing salt into wounds that hadn't quite healed yet. I told her that while I understood the role Hannah played in our family, they hadn't taken into account the role she played in my own journey of moving on. She paused, maybe letting my words sink in, but I sensed she didn't quite get it. To her, this was a matter of family ties and loyalty, while for me, it was about self-preservation. After the call, my siblings texted me, each with their own opinion. Some were supportive, saying they could see how hard the situation must have been for me. Others were more dismissive, saying I was too sensitive, that I'd made a big deal out of nothing. Even though they weren't directly involved, it was as though everyone felt the need to have a say. To analyze and dissect my reaction to Hannah's presence at the dinner, it hurt to realize that, in their eyes, I wasn't handling things the right way. That maybe, in their minds, I'd failed a kind of family test. I'd disrupted the image they all seemed to hold onto so dearly, that we were close-knit, unbreakable, that even something as significant as a breakup couldn't shake the foundation of our family dynamic. But deep down, I knew I hadn't left out of spite or anger. I'd left to preserve something of myself, something I felt I'd started losing in the aftermath of the breakup. This wasn't about rejecting my family or holding a grudge against Hannah. It was about taking back control of my own emotional well-being, setting a line that felt long overdue. Later that night, as I lay awake replaying everything, I realized that this confrontation with my family wasn't just about Hannah's presence. It was about learning to choose myself, even when it wasn't the easy or comfortable thing to do. The next few days were tense. My phone felt heavier than usual, as though each missed call or unanswered message from my family added weight. Mom didn't call again, and neither did my siblings. The silence was almost deliberate. The kind of quiet that punishes more than words ever could. They knew me well enough to understand how much I hated unresolved conflict. How uncomfortable silence between us would gnaw at me. As days turned into a week, I started to wonder if they'd ever come around or if this was going to be one of those permanent rifts in the family. I thought about calling my mom again, attempting some sort of apology or explanation, but a stubborn part of me held back. I'd apologized once and explained my side, but it hadn't changed anything. Would another call really make a difference? Each day felt like a balancing act between guilt and anger. On the one hand, I felt like I'd abandoned my mom on her birthday. On the other, I couldn't shake the feeling that they had chosen to ignore my emotional boundaries in favor of maintaining some picture-perfect narrative. When they were ready to make peace, I wanted it to be real, not a quick fix to get me back in line. To fill the void, I threw myself into work, drowning out the lingering tension with endless tasks and projects. My coworkers noticed a shift in my mood and even asked if everything was all right. But I couldn't bring myself to tell them about it. It felt too personal, and frankly, too absurd. I mean, who else but family could turn a birthday dinner into an existential crisis? One day, I decided to reach out to a close friend for advice. She listened patiently, without interrupting, letting me air out the mess of emotions I'd been holding inside. When I finished, she told me something that finally made sense. You're grieving the family you thought you had. It struck a chord. I realized she was right. I'd always assumed my family would have my back, especially during tough times, that they would understand me even when I couldn't explain myself well. But now, it felt like we were on opposite sides of a divide I hadn't seen coming. This wasn't just about Hannah being at dinner. It was about my family's willingness to ignore my feelings for the sake of their own comfort. That evening, I tried to look at the situation from my mom's perspective. She had always valued family above all else. To her, the idea of excluding someone she considered like family was probably unthinkable. Her disappointment in me wasn't just about leaving dinner early. It was about disrupting her vision of what family unity looked like. And in her mind, the presence of Hannah represented that unity, while my absence represented its collapse. I could understand it, but it didn't make it easier to swallow. My family was using their definition of togetherness as an excuse to overlook what I needed to heal. I wasn't against the idea of family unity. I simply wanted that unity to include my own boundaries and feelings. 2. The next day, my sister texted me, finally breaking the silence. It was short and to the point. Mom's still upset. Maybe you should just talk to her and make things right? Seeing my sister's message sent a ripple through me. Her words were minimal, but the meaning behind them was clear. I was expected to be the one to make peace. I was the one who had walked out. The one who'd caused the fracture. And now, I was the one who was supposed to patch things up. I sat with that for a while, letting the weight of it sink in. Was I willing to bend once more for the sake of keeping the peace? My whole life, I'd been the one to smooth things over. The one to make sacrifices in the name of family harmony. And here I was, faced with another expectation that I'd be the one to compromise. But something inside me had shifted after that dinner. For the first time, I didn't want to be the one who swallowed my hurt for the sake of others' comfort. And if my family couldn't accept that, maybe it was time for a different approach. I responded to my sister with a simple message. We need to have a real conversation, me, Mom, and everyone involved. I'm tired of pretending things are fine when they're not. She agreed to set it up. And a couple of days later, we gathered in my mom's living room. I hadn't seen most of them since the birthday dinner, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. My mom sat quietly, avoiding my gaze, while my siblings exchanged glances. Looking uncomfortable, I broke the silence. I know you're upset that I left, Mom, and I'm sorry for hurting you. But I also need you to understand why I felt like I couldn't stay. She looked at me, a mix of hurt and confusion in her eyes. You left because of Hannah. You couldn't just stay for one night? For me? It wasn't just about Hannah, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It was about feeling like my boundaries didn't matter. I needed space from her after the breakup. And I asked for that. You invited her without telling me. And it felt like my feelings were dismissed. But she's family to us, too, my mom argued, her voice rising slightly. Just because you two ended things doesn't mean we have to cut her out. She's been a part of our lives, too. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. I'm not asking you to cut her out, Mom. I just needed you to be honest with me about her being there. If you had told me ahead of time, I might have been able to prepare myself. But finding out when I walked through the door it felt like a betrayal. She sighed, looking away, her fingers tapping on the arm of the chair. I didn't want to hurt you. I thought maybe seeing her again would remind you of all the good times. Maybe even help you two work things out. Hearing her say that stung. I realized she hadn't truly accepted the breakup. And in her mind, the relationship still held value. Maybe even more value than my feelings in this moment. It wasn't your place to try and fix things. Though, I said quietly, I'm the one who has to live with my choices. I have to find my own way forward. And it's hard to do that when it feels like my family isn't on my side. My sister spoke up, finally breaking her silence. I think what he's saying, Mom, is that he just wants us to respect his choices. Even if we don't agree with them. The room went silent again as my mom processed that. I could see the hurt and disappointment etched on her face. But there was something else there too, a hint of understanding. Maybe even acceptance. I just don't want to lose family, she whispered finally, her voice wavering. And I thought Hannah was family. I nodded, feeling the tension in me begin to ease. I get that, Mom, but I need you to understand that. Right now, keeping my distance from her is what I need to heal. Maybe one day, we can all be in the same room without it hurting. But I'm not there yet. She nodded slowly, wiping a tear from her cheek. All right, I'll respect that. But please, don't stay away from us. I couldn't bear that. I managed a small smile. I'm not going anywhere. I just need you all to meet me halfway on this. In that moment, I felt a shift. It wasn't a perfect resolution. And I knew there were still lingering feelings on both sides. But there was understanding, a tentative truce. For the first time, I felt like my family had seen and accepted me. Not just as their son or brother, but as someone who had his own boundaries, his own needs. When I left that day, I felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted. In the days following that difficult conversation, I could feel the subtle changes in our family dynamic. The tension around my mom's birthday dinner, while not erased, had softened. My mom started texting more often. Brief check-ins that told me she was trying to respect the boundaries we'd discussed. I knew she still wanted to see Hannah as family, but I could tell she was making an effort to keep that separate from how she treated me. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. I was learning to live with this new normal, carving out a space where my needs, my boundaries, could coexist with my family's desire to hold on to the past. I knew they still wanted things to go back to how they were. To a time when Hannah was just my girlfriend and not a painful reminder of what didn't work out. But I couldn't ignore that. And I couldn't keep playing the role of the accommodating son if it meant losing my own sense of self. My sister reached out to me a few times, checking in, which was something she hadn't really done before. She even admitted she understood where I was coming from, saying she respected my decision to leave that night, even if it had hurt our mom. It was a small but meaningful sign of support, and I appreciated it more than I'd let her know. At family events that followed, my mom didn't bring Hannah up again. I think she finally accepted that even if they loved her, I wasn't in a place to share that love in the same way. And, unexpectedly, I started feeling comfortable enough to stay longer at family gatherings. I didn't have to brace myself for awkward mentions or side glances. I could just show up as myself. For better or worse. One day, my mom called out of the blue, asking if I'd like to help her with some small home projects she'd been putting off. I wasn't sure what her intentions were, but I agreed, thinking it would be nice to spend time together with a more neutral focus. We spent the day moving furniture, painting, and organizing her garage. The day quietly unfolding with a lot of laughter and the kind of conversations we used to have before everything became so complicated. As we packed up for the day, she surprised me. She turned to me, her voice soft. I know it might not always feel like it, But I do hear you. And I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. It must not have been easy. She gave me a small, tentative smile that spoke volumes. She was genuinely trying to understand. Maybe even to let go of her own hold on the past. I nodded, not trusting myself to say much without the words catching in my throat. Thanks, Mom. That means a lot. I walked away that evening feeling something I hadn't expected, a sense of peace. Not everything was perfect, far from it. But I felt a weight had been lifted. The burden of holding on to both my boundaries and my family's expectations. For once, I felt like we had all started to accept that healing doesn't always come from trying to fix what's broken, sometimes. It comes from accepting what is. And with that, I felt ready to move forward.